Good morning. Excited to be here. I'd like to invite you to travel back in time with me to the year 2003. And if you had asked me in 2003, I would have told you, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. It wasn't a strong thing, but I just didn't believe in God. I didn't believe it was true. And as an atheist, as Kenny said, I'd rarely go to church, if ever. But it was around this time, 2003, when I started going. I brought proof, that's me in the back row. And that's my wife, Peggy, next to me. So the truth was, I was only there to support her. She was moving in one direction towards God and Jesus, and I was moving in another. And I wasn't happy about it. When I was in church, I usually wasn't even paying attention, but if I was, I'd be thinking, you know what, this is all wishful thinking. It's a made-up story. It's a fairy tale. Now, I have to admit, come clean, there were times I actually went to church alone, without my wife. And you might be asking, why would an atheist go to church without his wife? It's a good question. So there, she's not there. I have twins. And at this time, they were 2 years old, William and Nicole. And while they're cute, and I love them to death, as you can imagine, they can be somewhat of a handful. And if my wife was out of town for the weekend, guess what? I had sole responsibility of them. And by Sunday, I needed a break. Church has free childcare. Let's go forward about 5 years. My kids are now 7 years old. And this is when I discovered I had a problem. I had to teach them right from wrong. I had to teach them good morals. They're going to be teenagers soon. And here's my problem. If we roll the clock back, we're going to go way back to 1989 when I was a teenager. Mr. Anti-Authority. I used alcohol, I used drugs, I used girls. I have lots of regrets. Here was the scary truth. I had to protect my kids from me. So what am I going to do? What am I going to teach them? Whose moral system am I going to use? Another person's? Well, that's just their opinion, and there's lots of opinions. Been going to church now for a while, and I have been hearing about Jesus. And you know, if in fact he was God, if that was true, then his moral system would be objective. And it seemed like it was a good moral system, but I didn't believe it. And I'm a skeptic. I question everything. Well, almost everything, as it turns out, because I never questioned my atheism. I never questioned my worldview. And that's what started me on a journey, a multi-year journey, and what I now call a skeptic's journey to discover the truth. I want to share some of the evidence that I found with you today. We're going to talk about the Bible, and the Bible being a book like no other. Why would that be? What evidence could I have found to convince me that the Bible wasn't a made-up story? Here's some puzzle pieces. We're going to talk about the authentic Bible. So this Bible here, is it authentic? In other words, is it the same or close to the same as what the original writer wrote? And we're going to talk about facts. Is the Bible more fiction or nonfiction? We're going to look at some of the evidence and see what it tells us. Specifically, we're going to talk about the New Testament. Something I actually didn't know, 27 different books, and they can each be treated as a history book. We're going to talk mainly about the Gospels today. And these Gospels and the New Testament, it was written 2,000 years ago. Isn't just a case of the telephone game? That's what I thought. You whisper one thing to someone else, and they whisper it. By the time you get to the end, it's a totally different story. Well, that must be what happened here. It was 2,000 years. Well, is there a way we can tell if that happened or not? Is there evidence we can look at? So we have an author who creates the original. Let's just say it's the book of Luke. And he writes it. He's going to handwrite it. He handwrites that book. And then manuscripts get created. So somebody copies that book, and they have to copy it by hand, and those are called manuscripts. Well, some more manuscripts get created, and that happens until about 1440 AD. It's when the printing press was invented. Now, this could be done by machine, not by hand. So it leaves us with about 1,400 years of copies of manuscripts. Unfortunately, we've lost the original, and we've lost many of the copies between then and some time period. They get lost. They were written on fragile material, papyrus or parchment, so they may be burned, they just deteriorated. We just don't have them. There's a discipline, part art, part science, called textual criticism that looks at this problem. There are textual critics that make their life out of looking at this problem. And what's interesting, at least it was for me, it's not just the Bible they do this for. It's all ancient works like Socrates, Josephus, any of those. They use this discipline to determine how accurate the books are to what the original was. It looks at three things. The first one is, how many copies do we have of these manuscripts? Now, I'm just going to say many, and I'll tell you why in a minute. The second thing that it looks at is, how big is the time gap, or how short is the time gap between the original and the first copies that we have, the first manuscripts that we have. The Bible is short. I'm glossing over these two because, as a skeptic, it didn't mean much to me. They were numbers. Okay, it's short, great, many, great. I had another problem with the Bible. Did you know that there's differences amongst all these manuscript copies? That really bugged me. How can we trust it if there's all these differences? Well, this is Bart Ehrman. He is a New Testament scholar. He does a lot of this textual criticism work. He's a smart guy. He's got degrees. He wrote a book, Misquoting Jesus, which is all about the differences in the books. Oh, I got to mention, too, we're talking about the differences in one book. So the book of Luke and all the copies we have of the book of Luke, the differences amongst those copies. That's what we're looking at here. This is what he says in his book. There are more differences amongst our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That means there's over 180,000 differences amongst these copies. Wow. Again, skeptic, that kind of fueled my, see, this is a problem. Well, it turns out that there is a third criteria. It's how significant are the differences. But it's not, are there differences? Because that's what Bart is pointing out. He's pointing out the differences. It's how significant are the differences. That's what the criteria looks at. That's what the discipline looks at. Bruce Metzger, he's also a New Testament scholar. He also has the same degrees as Bart. He was actually Bart's professor. Much of what Bart knows, he was taught by Bruce. He even calls him a second father figure. They were Christians. I say were, because Bart became an atheist. Primarily over the issue of pain and suffering, not the issues he had with the Bible, although that was part of it. So why do I bring this up? Well, because if you dig a little bit and you look in the appendix of the same book, you can read this. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Bruce Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by the textual variants. I'm going to give a little law enforcement analogy. I was a reserve sheriff deputy for Scott County for about 10 years, and I learned a lot about law, and it just really resonates with me. So I kind of hope it does for you too. Let's say we have a crime, and somebody is shot, and they're on the floor, and the paramedics come in. Well, they're going to come in, and they're going to try to save this guy on the floor, right? They're not going to be neat about it. They're going to open up bandages. They might move some things out of the way, maybe even move the body, do CPR. And then, that's over. the investigator comes in, and he sees this crime scene, and it's completely messed up. It's tainted. Well, the investigator doesn't just say, well, I can't use this, because look, it's all messy. No, he's going to take effort. He's going to remove the artifacts to find the evidence. That's what this discipline does. It looks at all the copies to remove the artifacts to try to find the original text. And again, he says it. They're not affected. As a matter of fact, only 1% of all those 180,000 differences affect any meaning at all. Most of them are punctuation, things like that. And none of them affect core doctrine. So that's one set of evidence, textual criticism, and it's a good set of evidence. 1, 2, and 3. Thousands of copies exist, which is way more than most any other ancient book. Short time gap, and now we've talked about the insignificant differences. And then I had an aha moment. Science has actually looked at their brain, and when you have an aha moment, it lights up. That's why it feels euphoric. And I had this aha moment about this problem. I thought about it. I said, let's suppose that a scribe embellished a story here, or even made up a story here. And then a different scribe did the same thing there, and a scribe did the same thing here. Well, what you'd end up with, this was the aha moment, it's like, well, wait a minute. At the end, they would all be different. There's no way they could be the same, but that's not what we see. There's differences, but the stories are essentially the same. I've been talking about textual criticism here, some numbers, and it's hard to fit in humor when you're talking about numbers. I wanted to add a little bit of humor that'll lead us into the next section. So, what did one eye say to the other? Between you and me, something smells. A little corny. If you see a crime in the Apple store, does that make you an eyewitness? Okay, eyewitness is what leads me into the next thing, though. That's why I use those jokes. This is J. Warner Wallace. He is a cold case detective. He's been doing that for many, many years. He solved some of the toughest, coldest crimes. He's been on Dateline. He was a strong atheist. And he would ridicule his Christian officers, his fellow officers. And then one day, he was in church. Kind of similar story. He was with his wife. And the pastor said, Jesus is the smartest man that ever lived. And that triggered something in his brain. He said, what? No way. So he went out and he said he bought a cheap New Testament book, started reading. He's going to put his cold case skills, things like no living eyewitnesses. There's no forensic evidence left anymore. The events are in the way distant past. And he was going to use that to refute Christianity. And instead, he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity because he became a Christian. And this book, during my journey, was just a game changer for me. It was an eye-opener, no pun intended, to the fact that the gospel writers or were eyewitnesses themselves or they were interviewing eyewitnesses. That was huge for me because they weren't following on faith. They were following on what they saw. In a court of law, we'll convict people based on eyewitness testimony. This was strong stuff, and there's no doubt that they claim to be eyewitnesses. They've seen, they've heard, they've touched, all themselves. Earlier, I was talking about the inconsistencies across the copies of a book. Now I want to turn our attention to the differences across the books. So Luke will tell a story one way, John will tell it another, Mark may be a little different, or not at all. This was a big problem of mine, too. If they're eyewitnesses, why wouldn't they tell the same story? So this was a problem for me. It bugged me. But you know who it didn't bug? Was J. Warner Wallace. And this is a short video from him where he's talking about this problem.
For a minute, on the differences I saw between accounts. That didn't bother me. I had other issues, but that wasn't one of them. And I'll tell you why, because by this time, at 35, I had been working multiple eyewitness accounts for nearly a decade. And I realized early on that no two eyewitnesses ever agree. Ever. It could happen. It could happen right now. It could happen while we're creating this tape. And do you know that you'll get two witnesses who will disagree about what happened 5 minutes ago? This happens all the time. There's variation between the resurrection accounts, absolutely. And that gave me great confidence because it's exactly the kind of variation I would expect to see if the resurrection accounts are real eyewitness accounts. And yes, they vary exactly to the degree I would expect them to.
So each author is writing to a different group of people with a different purpose. Mark's writing to the Romans, it's action-packed. Matthew's writing to the Jews, Luke is writing to the Greeks, and John is writing to unbelievers. So of course they're going to tell the story differently. They're trying to reach a different audience. It turns out that the inconsistencies actually point to true eyewitness testimony. So as I kind of summarize the authenticness of the Bible, we have many manuscripts, we have a short time gap, insignificant differences in eyewitness testimony. And you might notice there are some numbers missing there because there's other evidence that I don't have time to go into. But I'll let you know what they are. So we have disciples' writings. So during that gap when we have no manuscripts of the Bible, we have writings from other disciples that we can look at. There's evidence that the resurrection is a very early belief, perhaps within weeks of the movement. And the fact that we have evidence that the scribes were absolutely meticulous in what they did. So I had to conclude, based on the evidence, that the Bible seems to be authentic. Doesn't mean it's true. I wasn't there yet. Just means that this is probably what they wrote. But still could be made up stories. I had to get past that as well. Could have been made up from the beginning. So fiction, made up places, made up people, vague details. Nonfiction, truthful stories are going to have real people, real places, explicit details. So we can look at the evidence and we can look at the Bible and say, well, which one do we have? I was pretty surprised, actually. We have real places, confirmed by archaeology. I list here things that critics say the Bible got wrong. They didn't exist, there's no proof of them, but archaeology has in turn proved it correct. We'll look at a few of them. Luke says there's a term called polytarchs, which is a title for a leader. And critics were adamant that there was no such title. In 1876, they found a stone that lists polytarchs. And since then, they've found 64 more references. Another example, Pontius Pilate. There was no archaeological evidence of Pontius Pilate until 1961. And they found a stone, another artifact that named Pontius Pilate, but not only Pontius Pilate, but also Tiberius, which is the correct Roman emperor at the time. Then they found a ring in 1968, but they didn't know what it was. They couldn't decipher it. Until very recently, when advanced technology was able, they could figure it out and they deciphered it, and it does reference Pilate. So that was in 2018. One last one. Until 1968, there were no archaeological evidence of crucifixions. But in that year, they found this ankle bone with a nail through it. You can see the nail is bent, which is probably why it was still in there. And this is what's interesting. They found this in an ossuary box, in a tomb, with 2 chambers and 12 burial niches. You might know, why is that important? Because it also proves that a crucified victim could be properly buried in a Jewish tomb, which is, of course, what the Bible says happened with Jesus. It's actually estimated that only 20% of the Holy Land has been excavated. Only 20%. Most of it's built up on, and they can't excavate. You can imagine what else is there if they could find it, if they could go to it. Craig Evans, he said in a podcast, literally, nothing has been found that contradicts what's been said in the Bible, in the Gospels. So the Bible, we can check that box. It's got real places. What about real people? There's names all over the place. But not only names, their titles, and where they're from. This is 15 verses from Romans. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it. It'll take me a long time. But it names 27 people. And common names. So if I was to come to you and say, hey, did you know that John did this? You might have to ask, which John? I know a lot of Johns. It's a common name. Well, the same thing is true in first century Palestine. You may not have known this, but Jesus was a common name. Simon was a common name. And what you'll see in the Gospels is they're qualified. Which Simon am I talking about? Which Jesus am I talking about? So, real places, real people. How about those details? We're going to spend a little bit more time on this section. It's an interesting section. This is a map of the ship, the way they went. Paul and Luke went from Caesarea to Rome via ship. So how do you think they made this map? It's from the explicit details in the writings. That's how they're able to make the map. He even accurately describes the prevailing winds and how they had to sail because of them. We're going to unpack a story he talks about on this trip. He says, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So you have to ask, well, why did they suspect that? A little earlier, Luke says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. So if we think about it for a minute, it was cloudy, it was midnight, they probably couldn't see. Maybe they heard the waves crashing on the shoreline, so they suspected it. So they took a sounding, they put down an anchor, and they found 20 fathoms, which is 120 feet deep. A little farther on they went, 90 feet deep, so they're getting shallower, another sign they're getting towards shore. So they put down 4 anchors, prayed for day to come. Now the next day, they cast off those anchors, and they went into shore. So what's interesting, back to a little archaeology, they found 4 anchors in about 90 feet of water, in about the right location, about 40 yards apart. Unfortunately, they didn't know what they had. 2 of them got melted down for the metals. 1 of them was lost, but there is a 4th one that still exists, and they have been able to inspect it, and it does date to the 1st century. That's a lot of details. He goes on with explicit details, 276. Vague details would be 300, about 200. No, 276. Timelines, 3 months, 3 days, 1 day, 7 days, 2nd day, 7 days. In this verse, in Acts 3 verses, 11 nations, 6 nationalities. Medical conditions. So Luke and John both record medical conditions. Luke says his sweat became like blood. That's odd. John says when the arrow went in, blood and water came out, and that's odd. And the early disciples had problems with these. They thought it was allegory or symbolic, because that can't happen. Well, it turns out medicine has advanced. It can. There's actually medical conditions for this and the names. And I'm not going to try to pronounce that either, because I'll just get it wrong. Obscure little things you have to look kind of hard for. Passover festival, there's green grass, there's plenty of grass, there's 5 barley loaves. Well, Passover is a real event. It's after the rainy season, so there would be a lot of grass. It's after the barley season, so there would be barley loaves. Just little signs. Geography. Islands, plateaus, hills, elevation up and down. The number of cities that are named is astonishing, and it's really hard to fake geography. You either get it right or you get it wrong. The government, Roman rules for imprisonment, all that kind of stuff, plants and animals. Did you know that the sycamore tree, the fig tree, only grows in South Africa and Israel? These writers had to be from one of those 2 places if they were going to know about fig trees. And their animals are correct for the location. Buildings, their structures, customs like Passover and the purity and Sabbath. And by the way, if you look at the books that aren't in the Bible, the non-canonicals, they don't even come close with this stuff. Most of them don't even name anything besides Jerusalem. This is Sir William Ramsay. He was one of the greatest archaeologists of his time. He thought the Bible, Luke in particular, was written probably in the 200s. He became an archaeologist partly to refute the Bible. He ended up saying, Luke is a historian in the first rank. In short, this author should be placed amongst the greatest of historians. Luke names 95 people, 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without error. And William Ramsay shocked the intellectual world because he converted to Christianity. So based on this evidence, we got real places, we got real people, and we got explicit details. Now I concluded, wow, well, based on this evidence, this is a true story. When I started my journey, I actually started with the evidence for God. Right? There's no reason to look at Christianity or any religion if there's no God. And I found a lot of evidence for God. And this evidence that I found needed an explanation. And there's only 2 explanations. Either there's a God, a creator, or there's no God. So materials and nature needs to explain all this evidence. Well, what I found when I looked at the explanations is that the atheist worldview, I just say it this way, it was just inadequate. It had inadequate explanations for the DNA in our body, for the machines in our body, for the origin of life, for the Big Bang, for the laws of nature, for the fine-tuning, for the supernatural. Morals are part of the supernatural. Afterlife, near-death experiences, consciousness, conscience, art, beauty, emotions. It's all beyond nature and materials. And even evil and suffering, I think, points to a creator rather than nature and materials. So, why I say this, because it wasn't like a big event or anything, it's just I had to change paths. The path I was on of atheism just ended. Just ended. And the Bible, we talked about that. We talked about a book like no other, authentic facts. But as you might imagine, that's just the tip of the iceberg of the evidence for Christianity. And that led me to a second decision. Do I give in? Do I become a Christian? But that's a hard choice. You have to change your behavior. You have to change what you do. You have to serve others. You have to forgive. So, what do I do? Now, it turns out I have another problem. I have a fear. It's a real fear. But first, just kind of for fun, here's some other real fears. Did you know there's a fear of chins? Genophobia. There is a fear of the color yellow. Xanthophobia. It's a real fear. This one, you're not going to believe it, but it's true. There is a fear of ketchup. Look how long that is. That's a real fear. My fear is a real fear too. And it's the fear of being wrong. It literally paralyzes me. I don't want to buy anything because the next day it's going to be on sale. I was wrong. I'm a huge second guesser. So, what am I going to do? How do I get past this fear? So, I did some thinking, and I went back to law enforcement. And I went, I'm a juror. This is evidence. Look at all this evidence I found. I do the same thing in a trial. I'm a juror in a trial. There's a bunch of evidence, 2 sides, They're telling me what is the best explanation for the evidence, and I have to decide. So I looked at some jury instructions. A reasonable doubt is a doubt, so there is a doubt. It's not all possible doubt. It's based on reason and common sense. So if you are convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty, you're a juror, it's your duty as a juror to find the defendant guilty. So, if I am convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Christianity is true, it is my duty to find Christianity true. So recall, my journey started in 2008. My kids were 7 years old. I needed a moral standard. In 2011, I was baptized. I was all in. I was a Christian. I led small groups. I cleaned up my playlists. I cleaned up my library. I cleaned up my thoughts. Tried to be a better person the best I could. Fortunately, in 2015, a few years later, that fear, it gripped me again. I hate that fear. So I went back to the drawing board. I went back in. I did it secretively because everyone thought I was a Christian now. But I thought, I'm surrounded by Christians. Did I really give atheism a fair shot? So I went back and listened to podcasts. I listened to debates. I read books. And I got to the point where it became repetitive. And you've probably been there before where you're like, yeah, I heard that argument. Yeah, I heard that one. I heard that one. I'm like, I think I've heard them all. I think I've heard them all. So I ended up back in the same place I was before. That both God and Christianity are the best explanation for the evidence. And that means they're true. And I'm going to hand it back over to Joel. Thank you very much. Have a good day.